Steve Witkoff has been working for Donald Trump. Steve Witkoff has been pretty inept working for Donald Trump. He's, not my words, those from within the American administration, he's been a bumbling idiot. But you know where Steve Witkoff has succeeded? He has succeeded as an employee of Vladimir Putin. He's done one hell of a job.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin on the show. And just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Scott, welcome back to the Trump Report.
Hey, it's so good to be back, Maddie. Thank you.
It's been a few weeks since you graced us with your presence, and today, of all days, it's great to have you on. There's so much that has been going on in terms of these peace talks between the US, Ukraine, and Russia. But to kickstart, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, they have met with Vladimir Putin and members of the Kremlin in Moscow to discuss a peace deal. After 5 hours of constructive and meaningful talks, Putin has rejected the deal. Can you walk me through this, Scott?
You remember when we were going to get a Trump peace deal in Ukraine on day one of his administration? And then remember, I'm old enough to remember when he said, oh, we're going to have it by Thanksgiving, which I think was last week when I was in the States. And then yesterday, with the real estate developer and purported envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, hopping off to Moscow, you had all these people go, this is it, settlement's on the cards, settlement's on the cards. Like hell it is. Right? Let's walk through what exactly happened there and then put it in wider context. There are actually two proposals that are on the table. And it's really important to keep this in mind because a lot of people in the media, good people in the media, are making the mistake of conflating it and saying there's just simply one so-called peace plan. The initial plan from last month is the Kremlin's plan. It has been developed since the spring. In particular, it was developed by a key economic advisor named Kirill Dmitriev, who has worked with the Trump folks since 2017. And in mid-October, Steve Witkoff gave the Kremlin its opportunity. He called another Putin advisor, Yuri Ushakov, and he said, look, the U.S. has put sanctions on your oil companies and they're threatening to give tomahawks to Ukraine. What are we going to do about it, Yuri? And Yuri goes, oh, that's not very good at all. And Witkoff goes, you know what? You need to get Vlad or President Putin or whatever he called him. You need to get Putin to call Trump. And that's what the Kremlin did 2 days later. And that pushed back the tomahawks. When Trump met Zelensky the next day, no tomahawks to Ukraine. But even though Witkoff was still there saying, Ukraine should give up all of the Donetsk region, this key strategic area, because they all supposedly speak Russian there. Trump still said no, ceasefire on the basis of the front lines, right? The Kremlin sends Kirill Dmitriev jetting out to Florida the following week, and he sits down with Witkoff and with Kushner. And Kushner had not really, I think, been involved until then. He sits down with them, and they hash out this 28-point ultimatum to Kyiv, which is disguised as the Trump peace plan. Now, that ultimatum forces Ukraine to give up the Donetsk region. It forces it to stay out of NATO permanently. It keeps it militarily weak with limits on troops, strict restrictions on Western military assistance. Meanwhile, Russia gets out of the sanctions. It gets back into the G8, and the Trump administration profits both from compensation for security guarantees and from 50% of the profits from the UK Recovery Fund, right? So this is the setup, what the Kremlin wanted working with Witkoff and Kushner. It got derailed. It got derailed in early November because of Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. Rubio doesn't like this plan. Rubio doesn't think you should be giving away that much to the Kremlin. And so he let it be known through American legislators, this is a Russian plan. This is not our plan, it's the Russians. And those legislators said that at a major security conference in Canada. The next day in Geneva, Rubio's the head of the American delegation, and that's when Europe comes up with this counterproposal. And I could go through it in detail, but the key thing here is the Europeans are saying ceasefire. You ceasefire first, then we'll discuss everything, right? And that was reiterated this past Sunday when Rubio is meeting the Ukrainians and Witkoff and Kushner on either side of him, right? Now, Rubio was controlling that conversation. Witkoff and Kushner didn't say boo to a goose then. Again, on Monday, just before going out to the Kremlin, Witkoff meets the head of the Ukrainian delegation, Rostov Umarov, right? We don't know what they discussed. We know that Witkoff he looks unkempt, he looks unshaven. He doesn't look like that really smart, fantastic superstar real estate developer that we've come to know and love. He looks like he doesn't want to be there. But the fact of the matter is that he's heading off with Kushner to Moscow, and Ukraine wants to know if it's going to be sold down the river, right? Okay, we get to Tuesday, so now we're to the meeting. And if I can walk you through it, when we've got these two competing proposals that are up there, because we know which one the Kremlin's going to favor, right? They were supposed to start that meeting at 5 o'clock in Moscow. And that was 2 o'clock in Ireland. And I was watching it closely because we had the big event yesterday that we may discuss later, which is Ukraine President Zelensky was here in Ireland, right? So I was like watching both events. I was doing studio work and nothing was coming up, on all the feeds that I'm covering. Meeting hadn't started. Meeting didn't start until after 5 o'clock Ireland time, which is after 9 o'clock Moscow time, because Putin kept Kushner and Witkoff waiting for 3 hours. He gave some speech at it's called the Russia Calling Forum, which is some puff piece thing about how great Moscow is. And Kushner and Witkoff, they're twiddling their thumbs. They finally show up in the Kremlin 3 hours later. They look like two schoolboys that have been called in to see the headmaster, right? There's Kushner sitting ramrod straight like he always does, like he got that stick up his back because he's a hedge fund manager. He's an investment guru. And then Witkoff sitting there a little bit going, man, hey, looking like, oh, I'm excited. I'm back. I'm back in the headmaster's office. Putin is flanked by his top economic advisor, Dmitriev, who hammered out that 28-point ultimatum, and by the foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov. Witkoff and Rubio, the only person beside them is a woman who I suspect was a translator. Now, hopefully this time she actually was a translator from the U.S. Embassy and not from the Russian intelligence services, which has happened on Witkoff's previous trips. So they're sitting there, and the only video we have is at the start of the meeting when Witkoff starts going, we had a lovely walk. Moscow's so wonderful. It's such a gorgeous city, right? And I'm thinking, well, Steve, it's almost your second home now alongside Miami, so I can see why you would say that. And Putin goes, yes, it is lovely, isn't it? We made great efforts to beautify it. It's wonderful. It's like I'm watching a flaming tourist video here. And then the feed cuts out, right? Because then the headmaster is going to talk to his two schoolboys. Okay, what gets discussed, what comes out of it? Witkoff and Kushner have not said a word. Nothing. Now, Marco Rubio did. And I think it's interesting that Rubio framed this in a way, again, to undercut Witkoff and Kushner if they were going to sell out by saying, we think progress has been made on security guarantees for Ukraine, right? So he's stressing those security guarantees for Ukraine. The Russians, however, control most of the information narrative. And they come out and they say, well, some of the American points were acceptable, but others, no, not acceptable. No, it's not acceptable. Then they say, and this is how Yushakov frames it, foreign policy. We had these meetings with representatives. We will continue to meet with the Americans with these two people. He doesn't even give their names, with these two people, right? And then he says, and if this progresses, says we will have meetings at presidential level if this progresses. So the Kremlin's keeping the Trump folks dangling. So let's review exactly what's on this. The Kremlin has helped devise the ultimatum to Ukraine. The Europeans have tried to undermine it and put a counterproposal. Because Witkoff and Kushner have not been able to win the battle within the Trump administration, the Kremlin is going to keep them, they're going to stay at a distance here, right? Fundamental of this is the Kremlin is not going to agree to anything, not even their own ultimatum, until they have the guarantee they get all of the Donetsk region and that is legally recognized. That's the key play that's happening here. And in the meantime, they are not going to agree to a ceasefire. So if I could add one other thing that happened in context, Putin has not said anything about the meeting with Witkoff and Kushner. His big message came out just before the meeting, while he was keeping them waiting. We don't want to have a war with Europe, but if we have to, we will, right? Okay, that's great. We're supposed to be talking about ending Russia's invasion, right? Peace plan and all that. And he's threatening war with Europe. Why is that? The European proposal is unacceptable. It's being foisted upon us. So what Putin's trying to do is, as he's got the two schoolboys waiting, is to get Europe out of the picture again. Get that European proposal kicked into touch so the Kremlin controls the narrative. And it's that narrative over Donetsk, keeping Ukraine militarily weak. And here's the other stinger, because I know we're going to discuss this in detail, the sweetener for the Trump folks. If you let us have Donetsk, if you remove the sanctions, if you keep Ukraine weak and split, we'll have joint economic projects with you.
And we'll get into that and we'll get into territory in a minute, Scott, but just no one really thought a deal would be made on Tuesday. Anyone who's been following along with this, we've been going in circles, going in the same patterns for months now. But do you consider it more of a situation that Putin is dragging the US on with these false promises of negotiation as a tactic to get them away from listening to Kyiv and listening to the Europeans?
They're trying to get the ultimatum. I mean, that's what they're trying to do. And had it been the case, had it not been, and I'm not a huge fan of Marco Rubio on a lot of issues, including current ones like the fact the U.S. might be going to war in Venezuela. But the fact of the matter is had it not been for Rubio being there, the Kremlin might have gotten this ultimatum. What Rubio was able to do, because remember, sorry, I should preface that. Remember Keith Kellogg, who had, been another person who's saying we don't give in to the Russians like this. Kellogg's gone. He was the envoy to Ukraine. He's formally resigning in January. So Rubio's there standing against Kushner, Witkoff, and J.D. Vance. There are a lot of people at working level in the military, in the State Department, in the intelligence services, in the Treasury, who don't want to give in to the Russians. But they needed a frontline representative. And they have it with Rubio. The Russians have got to get Rubio out of the way somehow.
Well, I was going to say, Scott, what we found out about Steve Witkoff in the last 2 weeks is, of course, these leaked audio recordings, these videos of him and Putin interacting, even way back a few months ago when he's got his hand on his heart, ready to see his old friend Vladimir Putin. And, of course, we see their interactions in these meetings. Can he be trusted to orchestrate a peace deal in favor of Ukraine?
You know the answer to that, Maddie. There's the interviewer's trick. Ask a question that you already know the answer to, and then have the interviewee feed it back to you. Yeah, I'm not sure I can say it as well as you can. Like hell, he can't. Like Steve Witkoff has been working for Donald Trump. Steve Witkoff has been pretty inept working for Donald Trump. He's not my words, those from within the American administration, he's been a bumbling idiot. But you know where Steve Witkoff has succeeded? He has succeeded as an employee of Vladimir Putin. He's done one hell of a job, right? In fact, he's working for free for Putin, but he's going to try to get the credit for this deal because, again, I have to emphasize, and we're going to go into detail in a minute, it's not like he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Witkoff is going to get credit for a deal that's going to open up all types of economic, quote, opportunities for U.S. firms working with the Russians. That's where his heart lies. He has no interest in any type of provision for Ukraine's security, for its long-term welfare or for its people. Has no interest whatsoever. And I will add also, because he gets most of the attention, because he's been the real estate developer on the scene all year, I don't think Jared Kushner has got an interest in Ukraine's future either. I don't think Kushner gives a damn. I think you're seeing a bit of a replay of what happened here with Israel and Gaza. And that is that Witkoff and Kushner got into this in the autumn to strike a deal, which thank goodness has paused Israel's mass killing in Gaza, even if that killing is increasing in the West Bank, by the way. But the reason why you got that deal, the incentive is you could have all these massive economic projects in Gaza, and the Americans will get a piece of the pie.
Just, I want to stay on Rubio for a minute, Scott, because look, he was on Fox News and he praised the efforts of the Ukrainian military on the front line, saying that that the Ukrainian military had just done so well in terms of pushing Russia back, and that Russia was willing to sacrifice 7,000 lives a week to achieve its goal. So he obviously understands the, I guess, simplicities of where we're at in the war and who's actually winning and how well Ukraine has done. But he did tell Fox that Ukraine and Russia are now fighting over a narrow 30 to 50 kilometer stretch along the current front lines in Donbass. We're working to find what Ukraine can accept with real enforceable security guarantees so Russia can never invade again. But Scott, I think the wording of that is a bit interesting because they're not fighting over land. One country is defending their own sovereign land and the other one is trying to steal it from them, especially because, as Rubio points out, any Ukrainian, anyone in the military or a civilian, anyone is concerned that there will be a third invasion.
Yeah, I mean, Rubio's got to calibrate what he says, Maddie, because he's got to be careful that even though he's actually opposing Witkoff and Kushner, and remember, Vance, the vice president, he can't come in studs up and say, you guys are absolutely buffoons who are there to make profit. We're not going to be having it. So let me walk you back a minute. You may remember I mentioned that he undercut the initial ultimatum by briefing the legislators, who then came out and said it's a Russian plan in Canada. It was interesting that hours later, Rubio, to cover his back, said, "Oh, I never told them. I never told them that. No, not me, not me." What he does here in that interview with Fox last night with Donald Trump's bestie, Sean Hannity, is he comes out and minimizes Donetsk, right? It's only that 30 to 50 mile front line. In fact, you're talking about 6,600 square kilometers of territory that are in play here, about 22% of Donetsk. And that's vital because, as you mentioned, that's the highway to Kyiv. So Rubio is sort of, he's playing that bit where he's hedging just a bit. And that does raise a question as to whether Rubio, if this comes down to a real knockdown, drag-out fight in the administration, will say that Russia should get some part of Donetsk, if not necessarily all of it. I can't be sure where this lands. But I will add another element in here that I think does give some support for Rubio's position and for those within the Trump administration, the adults in the room who are doing this on a day-to-day basis, who are trying to hold back the Russians, and that's Congress. There are a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill who are not happy with the feeling that Trump is basically doing the Kremlin's bidding. And remember where Rubio comes from. He's a longtime senator on the Hill, and so he has connections with those legislators. And I think if you look at American public opinion, there's a large majority who say that Ukraine needs to be backed. There is a large majority that is currently opposed to Trump's approach to Ukraine. And I think Rubio's got that lever with those Republican legislators. I know they don't stand up to Trump often, but I think this is an issue where they will. I think they're not going to accept Donetsk being given to the Russians. That has become the touchstone issue. And the real problem is, the real question, we might as well put it out there, is if Marco Rubio gets fired. And Trump has fired officials in the past, has dumped them. If he fires Rubio, then you don't have a frontline member in the Trump administration to try to shield Kyiv from all the guys that are trying to pick it apart.
Well, especially after General Keith Kellogg announced that he was leaving his post in January, as you said, Scott. But Witkoff and Rubio were reportedly meant to fly straight from Moscow to Brussels to have a meeting with Zelensky. They ended up flying straight back to the US. So if that's the case, they're now back in the US. What does that mean that this meeting was then cancelled?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So Witkoff and Kushner, we get the flash last night through a couple of sources. I think Axios is one of it. I think Barker Avid was putting this out, saying, look, they're going to meet with Zelensky somewhere in Europe. And of course, Zelensky had been in Ireland. We knew he was leaving Ireland. So maybe he makes a stopover somewhere. It later comes out that the report is they were supposed to meet in Brussels, but it gets scrubbed. What is really interesting is that it is circulating, and I need to check this out. I got to be honest with you, but people are saying that Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, said that they told Kushner and Witkoff go straight back to the U.S. Right? It's almost like the Kremlin said, "No, you're not doing this stopover. We want you to go talk to Trump." Right? Now, if that is true, if that's the way that it's panned out, it goes back to what I talked about in terms of Putin with that threat to Europe that he made just before the meeting. They don't want the Europeans involved. They don't want Zelensky involved. They'd love to cut the deal with the Americans, but I don't think that's possible. So they want to back Zelensky into a corner, and to do that, you have to split him away from those European foreign ministers who are actually meeting today, the NATO foreign ministers, I should say, and who are reaffirming their support for Ukraine, both in terms of aid commitments as well as saying no capitulation over Donetsk, no capitulation over territory.
Scott, before we get into those NATO foreign ministers meeting, just to wrap up the meeting between the US and the Kremlin, 3 words to describe it.
I want 4.
Okay,
Go
do
4.
4.
Worst tea party ever, right? Jared and Steve they wait 3 hours to get their cup of tea in Russia. Then they have to sit at that 20-foot long table. Now remember, that table became notorious just before and after the Russian invasion because Putin would sit at one end of it and he would make his guests sit at the other end. Okay, this time they get to sit on, opposite each other. So they don't have to sit 20 feet away. But they have to sit there and they have to go through that tedious small talk about beautiful Moscow. And then they have to listen for 5 hours. And maybe they got a cup of tea in the middle of it while the headmaster, to mix my metaphors, says, now you boys, we want you boys to go behave yourselves, right? And we'd like you boys to go back. I'd like you to go back to my friend Donald, and I'd like you to make sure that you repeat exactly what I say. Now, I think Steve doesn't mind being kept waiting. I think Steve actually, come on. It's kind of a bromance with Vlad. Let's cut to the chase on it. And Jared, man, Jared's got an investment fund to look after. So he doesn't mind waiting for his cup of tea either. But where the rubber hits the road is they have now got to go back and try to lock Donald Trump in on this ultimatum again. And there's the hurdles. There's Rubio, there's Congress, and there's the fact, and I need to give credit here, that both Zelensky and the Europeans are not giving away. As much pressure is being put on them, they are not budging at this point.
Well, let's get into it. NATO foreign ministers are meeting today in Brussels. Germany has announced a 200 million, euro procurement of military equipment. Canada has announced that they will buy additional military material for Ukraine worth 200 million as well. Norway's foreign minister has also pledged 500 million euros to buy more weapons for Ukraine. So your reaction to this, Scott, what else do they need to do and step up? There's been this conversation with the EU trying to convince Belgium to jointly transfer these frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, and Putin, we don't want him to derail these plans. So all this together, your reaction to this and how the EU can step up.
Okay, we've actually got 2 different levels. So let's take NATO and then EU. So NATO, the commitments have now reached $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion for this month. The Germans are involved, as you mentioned. The Canadians have made a commitment. The Norwegians, the Netherlands are involved, a couple of other countries. And just as a reminder, this is all because of Trump's insistence. I'm not going to give weapons to Ukraine, but I will sell weapons to Ukraine via NATO countries. And so NATO's saying that to maintain Ukraine's resistance, you need about $1 billion worth a month through that program. So that's the military side of it. Ukraine's not going to get the Tomahawks right now, but they do have the British and French missiles, and perhaps more importantly, they've got their domestically manufactured missiles and they've got their drones. And they have hit another oil refinery overnight. They have hit a series, and this is interesting, a series of, that Russian shadow fleet that we talk about that circumvent the oil sanctions. They have hit at least 4 of them within the past week. And it's being reported by various outlets. They may have hit up to a dozen in recent weeks. So you need to maintain that military defense and also the counterattack. They need more air defenses as well, because Vlad's going to keep on with the missile and drone strikes each night, trying to kill civilians and break energy infrastructure. The other side, where we get to the EU, that's the financial side. And that is that Kyiv is going to need an estimated 136 billion euros over the next 2 years, 26, 27. Almost all of Ukraine's taxes go to the military, understandable reasons. So who finances public services? Who finances welfare? Who keeps the lights on and who keeps, the trains running and keeps roofs over people's heads? That's where you need the Europeans to come in. The sticking point we've got right now is, how do you provide those funds? Now, one option has been, and it took a long time to get there, what's being called a reparations loan. And that is, you take the 300 billion euros in Russian assets, 2/3 of which are held in Belgium, and you use that to back the reparations loan of about 136 billion. In other words, you cover Kyiv for the next 2 years with that loan. The Belgians are playing hardball over this. And they've come out and made a restatement through their foreign minister today that they don't like this. They feel like they will carry liability if the Russians decide to take legal action over it. I was talking to a very good Irish-based analyst about this, Irish analyst who's based in Brussels last night about this. He thinks there's more to it. He thinks Brussels just simply is dragging its feet over making this commitment. And we're still trying to work out the political reasons beyond that statement of liability. If you don't go with the reparations loan, the EU has to borrow the money off markets effectively. And that's what the Belgians are saying. Belgians have just said, hey, go borrow the money off markets. But of course, borrowing 136 billion euros is not as easy as it sounds. You have to try to maintain economic, financial stability. You have to look at where you're borrowing the money from, et cetera. And you really need to do this pretty sharpish. This is not like Ukraine's going to fall apart, but we do know that it's going to go into a winter where it's got a serious strain on the energy network because of the Russian attacks, where you have got, again, the need to maintain governance in a critical period. And you need to do that in part, and show you can do that, because Ukraine's having to deal with this corruption scandal that's hit the highest levels. So I think the EU will get there. I think they either will arrange to bank the borrowing off the markets, or they will finally reach a compromise with the Belgians. It's just, I would like to see that by the end of this year rather than this dragging into 2026.
Well, on the note of how the US can really step up, Congress is now back from holidays. Do you see Lindsey Graham bringing his sanctions package to the Senate floor for a vote? He said that Trump had greenlit it. We've heard stalling since, but he said that he's got 85 co-sponsors and has since about April. One House congressman, I think, is pushing a discharge petition as well. So do you see this happening? Because this essentially would be 500% tariffs slapped on any country importing Russian energy.
Yeah, first of all, look, Lindsey likes to get his name into the headlines. And again, Lindsey is torn between the fact that he wants to be Donald's bestie, and then he actually wants to be seen to be doing something effective here. You would have to look at many more people beyond Lindsey Graham talking about pushing the sanctions bill through. And you've got to remember that would have to have, for example, the backing of the Republican leadership probably. I don't think you can do it off a discharge petition. So you'd have to talk not just about John Thune, the Senate Republican leader. You've got that fly in the ointment, and other names I could give him, Mike Johnson, the House Speaker. I think the focus here, Maddie, is on the existing sanctions. Now remember, for all the talk of Witkoff and Kushner and all the others who would like to be in Vlad's pocket, or at least get access to Vlad's pocketbook for these projects, the working level officials have gotten the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two largest oil firms, Rosneft and Gazprom. And those sanctions affect the customers of Rosneft and Gazprom, Turkey, India, China. They have dented Russia's oil revenues already significantly. In fact, there's some estimates that Russia's oil revenues may be about half of where they were earlier this year. You've got to make sure that people like Witkoff and Kushner don't get those sanctions reversed. That's the first priority. Second priority, you've got to make sure that not just Witkoff and Kushner, but Pop Gun Pete Hegseth doesn't take it into his head to suddenly decide to suspend military assistance, including the sale through NATO countries to Ukraine. So you've got to maintain that military pipeline that takes place. And with such a chaotic Trump administration, it's never a guarantee that they're actually going to do the right thing and maintain it. So I think that's where the focus is. And again, I think it's sort of like maintain your current measures that you have and gradually expand. Gradually expand the military assistance pipeline, gradually tighten the sanctions, and push back the Kremlin's disinformation effort. Don't let them justify seizing more Ukrainian territory.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you for joining the Trump Report.
Thanks very much, Maddie.